Okay, so hi everybody. Welcome to Wellness in Your House today. Today's topic is about healthy boundaries. We want to go on over to the next slide.
So before we start, I'll like to offer us all a territorial acknowledgement. So we would like to humbly acknowledge that we work, live, love, and learn on the traditional lands of the Tecumloops to Secwepemc, within Secwepemcúlecw, the traditional and unceded territory of the Secwepemc. So in keeping with today's content, it is important to acknowledge that Thompson Rivers University occupancy on these lands has been done without consent. So I'll give maybe a moment for everybody to just sit where they are and just reflect what it means for you to be on the land and get to benefit from this land and work within this land.
And also, if we have anyone that's calling in from a territory outside of Kamloops and would like to acknowledge, you can totally do so in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and do so over the mic.
I'll acknowledge territory. I'd love to acknowledge that I'm listening from, learning from, super excited to hear the traditional territory of the Ta'aquechan Council and the Kwamandun First Nation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing.
Okay, so we're just going to introduce ourselves. So I'm Jessica. I'm a student wellness ambassador.
And I'm Takara. I'm a student wellness ambassador as well, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Yes, sorry, my pronouns are she, her, and hers as well. So we're going to be guiding you through today, and we'll go over to our agenda now, and we'll just kind of give a little overview of things we're going to cover today. So we're just going to journey about boundaries. We're going to go over what boundaries are and are not, certain types of boundaries. We're going to discuss some of the barriers that people may face when setting healthy boundaries. We're going to give a little visual what boundaries can look like for certain people of the ocean, fortress, and the fence. A little 3-step guide in setting healthy boundaries. Some things, little tips to try out and maybe avoid. How to handle it when somebody breaks your boundaries. We're going to introduce some of the resources and supports that exist in Kamloops, both on and off campus. And we're going to wrap up everything we unpack today together. And again, some of the stuff we bring up today might, rise up some feelings or thoughts that you might want a little extra support in processing. So we do have 2 resources that are listed on this slide, as well as every slide in the presentation, just for quick, easy access. And that's Here to Talk. It's a new student help chat that's available at heretotalk.ca. And then also the email to access counseling services through TRU. Okay, so boundaries. What are boundaries? So boundaries are really, the Reader's Digest version is that it's a clear communication to express our level of comfortability in certain. They help other people know what we will and will not accept for our own selves. They're a really great way to honor and get in touch with ourselves. And boundaries also include responsible action, which is really important. We can kind of think of boundaries along a spectrum. So they show where one thing stops and something else starts for us personally through our own perception. So for example, when teasing for me stops being playful and starts being hurtful, that's somewhere that I might want to set a boundary, but where that stops and starts. Boundaries are something that we naturally have a right to. They're our own personal responsibility to communicate and to uphold. They're a way to protect and respect our own selves as well as the people around us. They're different for everybody. They're a component and foundation for healthy relationships, and boundaries are actually really healthy.
So what boundaries are not? So boundaries are not a personal attack on a person. Often when people aren't used to communicating boundaries in a relationship, they can really feel like it. So I think an important thing to remember is if somebody is setting a boundary with you, it's not inherently personal. It's something that they are doing for themselves. It's not an attack against your character. Usually when people set a boundary, they're doing it because they want to prolong their relationship with you in a healthier way that makes it sustainable for them. So boundaries are not just a suggestion. Boundaries are not a dictation or set of rules that other people need to abide by. So when you're setting a boundary with somebody, that's something that you bring and you're not enforcing it on them. They have the choice whether or not to uphold that boundary you've set with them. And then depending on how they respond to it, you then have the choice if you want to carry out that relationship or not anymore. So boundaries are not the responsibility for others to interpret or identify, and that's where that personal accountability piece comes in, where we have to kind of in practicing self-care, we have to take that time for ourselves to identify what are my boundaries, where am I holding resentment in my relationships? And, we can't expect others to guess what we're thinking and feeling. So it's really important to take that time to explore where your boundaries lie and be able to communicate that to others. So boundaries are not known until we express them often, kind of, reiterating what I said before, but others might not know until we say that. So boundaries are not something that others can decide for you. Boundaries are not selfish, they're not cold, they're not high maintenance or unreasonable. I think that's a common way we feel when we begin to start the journey of setting boundaries, is we feel like we're too difficult or we're being annoying or stressful, but really they're self-preservation. And boundaries are not harmful in healthy relationships. They're actually one of the most important foundations for healthy, long relationships.
Mm-hmm. And something else too that I didn't add to that slide, but also just wanted to point out and going over it now, is that boundaries are also sometimes something we're not entirely aware of ourselves until we're in a certain situation, that we notice a feeling comes up for us that, okay, in this situation or in these circumstances, I'm feeling really uncomfortable, or I'm feeling, XYZ. And it's totally okay to identify that in those situations. We don't always know what our boundaries are until we're presented with them. So that's totally normal.
And I'm really glad you brought them up, because that does really kind of further explore that how they're not known piece. I think sometimes we're maybe not taught about those boundaries. And that's all part of the process of getting to know yourself and getting to know yourself in the relation of others. It's a lifelong journey. And I feel like we're all going to be continuously met with boundaries we were not aware that we had until we learn them all throughout life. So there are different types of boundaries. So a few that I have listed here is physical, emotional, mental, and time and energy. So physical boundaries, when we think to physical boundaries, we often think of our sexual relationships with others, and, the practice of consent. But there's boundaries in the realm of physical and all kinds of other ways. So there's boundaries on proximity. If somebody is maybe too close with you, I'm sure that many of us have really been thinking about that boundary a lot since COVID and the pandemic, having a boundary with people getting 6 feet in between you. There's physical touch. I think a lot of us were learned to always hug people and hug one another. I know I'm a really touchy person, but now I've learned to step back and recognize that that's a boundary of a lot of people, and I have to ask for permission before I hug people. Public displays of affection. Another one too is comments on your physical appearance, your sexuality, and your personal space. And then for emotional, so boundaries on topics, emotional dumping, dismissing emotions. A really big one is, I think, being mindful of what you can take in. I think this one presents itself a lot in friendships and relationships where maybe people are asking for your support or to share emotional content with you when you're maybe not in the space where you can take that. And then mental, so boundaries to have your own beliefs, your values, and your opinions. And then time and energy, so how much time is spent doing a task, spend time with others or alone, spent time waiting. Maybe you have a boundary if somebody is always really late and that kind of messes up your daily schedule. When to contact, setting boundaries on when people can contact you, or when time will be spent working or studying.
Yeah, and some more types of boundaries that we have listed here. So material boundaries. So that would kind of include things like boundaries around our personal possessions, when they can be used, how they are treated. If we choose to lend or borrow things. Another one would be conversational boundaries. So that kind of ties into that one piece we touched on with emotional boundaries, about like the topics you are comfortable or not comfortable discussing. Agreements on how to speak to each other, agreements on how to argue. And I think that that's a really important dynamic in relationships, is the boundaries of how arguments will take place. Mm-hmm. Another one, content boundaries. So again, content you choose to engage or not engage with, that could be in conversations, but also a big one for that would be over like social media. That's a big one that's been coming up a lot lately. We have something in the chat here from Chelsea. She says, Dolly Parton told Brene Brown her biggest pet peeve as a leader is when people are late, a boundary that she has to set with people. Totally. And I feel like that's, a really common theme for sure. I know that, I really am bothered if I'm ever running late. And it is just kind of, for a lot of people, it's a respect thing, and it's a boundary that they set, and it's totally, valid. Yeah. So go on over to the next slide here. And we've got another thing in the chat. And Sarah says, or when people go overtime in a meeting. Yeah, for sure. Especially when we have schedules we're trying to stick to. And that can be a little bit trickier too when we're virtual, right? I know my friends who aren't in school and they're not working from home, and they're not doing the whole virtual experience that we're all kind of trying to navigate right now. They don't really understand those boundaries and how important they are to, maintain some sanity in all of this and not just get totally dragged into the screen life at all hours. Chelsea, that might be me sometimes. Sorry, no, I don't think you ever really go over. We're good. All right, so boundaries, true and false.
So some falses about boundaries. So these are just kind of common ones that are often misconceptions about what setting boundaries is like. So for the false, setting boundaries can create strife in relationships. Setting boundaries makes me harder to love. Setting boundaries makes me seem difficult. Setting boundaries is selfish or self-centered. So those are all false misconceptions about boundaries. And I think a lot of that is really rooted in kind of the lack of permission that we often give ourselves to take up space. I don't know about you, Jessica, but that's often how I feel, especially in my walking experience as a woman too. I think I've had to really deconstruct a lot of ideas about taking up space and setting boundaries and stating what I am and am not comfortable about. So that's my personal experience.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree. Setting boundaries. I think there's a lot of fears around setting boundaries for a lot of people. I know myself, in certain situations, I've felt kind of nervy about, setting a boundary or how to approach it. And I think one really important thing that we'll touch on later on in the presentation is that boundaries are really like a huge learning experience. And that kind of, that attitude, at least for me personally, has really helped with my ability to set healthy boundaries.
Absolutely. So in, I don't know what the word is, but in resisting some of those false notions about boundary settings, here are some truths about boundaries. So boundaries shows maturity. Boundaries reduce resentment. I think that's a really huge one. And I think we actually may touch on this later on in the presentation. But they make relationships a lot more sustainable, and they reduce your resentment for things going unsaid. And can definitely be a great bridge into solving kind of relationship flaws, or I don't know if flaws is the right word, but yeah. Boundaries improve your relationship with yourself, right? It's showing up for yourself and making space for yourself. Boundaries can strengthen healthy relationships. Boundaries can help us identify red flags. Boundaries can offer opportunities for learning, growth, and healing, and boundaries protect your energy. Jessica,
we have
did you?
it here. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, I was just gonna say in the chat we have a comment here from Livy says, especially as a woman, I've been met with being told that I'm loud or bossy when I'm simply setting a boundary. Yeah, I think that that's, you know, a pretty common theme for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Or like, I won't say it, but like the awful B word, that gets hoisted upon women all the time, often in scenarios where women are setting boundaries on how to be treated. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So some examples of healthy boundaries. So the first one here, we tried to just kind of break down like certain responses that someone might give while setting a healthy boundary in certain situations. So this first one is a reminder that my pronouns are they, them. I feel invalidated when you misgender me, whether it's intentional or not, and I would appreciate it if from now on you would refer to me by my correct pronouns. Second one here, I'm not comfortable partaking in conversations about someone else's personal business. Gossiping makes me feel unaligned with my values. I'm going to step out of this conversation and I'll catch up with you later. The last one here, well, on this slide, when we're arguing and I am interrupted, I feel unheard and disrespected. I know we both have thoughts to share about what's going on, and I value your thoughts and feelings and want to hear what you have to say too. It would really mean a lot to me if we could agree to wait until each other have finished speaking before we respond to each other. If we can go on over to the next one. I understand that you're trying to be funny, but that joke is actually really offensive. I'm not comfortable with making a punchline out of someone else's hardships. And in the future, can we share jokes with each other that everyone can laugh to? I'm feeling unsafe with how quickly this situation has escalated. I'm going to go for a walk so that we can both cool down. I would ask that you respect my space for now and not follow me. And this is one that I've actually had to practice myself quite regularly lately. I've noticed that quite a bit of your posts on social media account perpetuate insert issue here. Could be prejudice, sexism, racism, diet culture, anything that's a little bit, of like a touchy subject. I know we have had conversations about this in the past, and I respect that you are entitled to post what you choose. I only follow accounts that post content encouraging equity and wellness, so I'm going to unfollow your social media account. So if we take a look at these examples, something that we'll notice is that all of these boundaries are something that, is stemming from a really important place for the individual, important things that are, value aligned. And there's some responsible action in there. So in each of these boundaries, it's not so much I feel uncomfortable, so you need to do this, right? We're not saying you need to stop posting this on social media or you need to change this about yourself. It says, I'm not comfortable, so here's what I'm going to do. Here's what I would like instead. There's some responsible action that's attached to each of these healthy boundaries, which is a really, really important part. When we place a boundary in somebody else's hands to kind of uphold, then we're giving away our power and we're disempowering ourselves, right? And so the idea behind healthy boundaries is to empower ourselves, which also in turn helps empower others. We have some in the chat here. I'm just going to catch up on the chat. These are excellent responses. Thank you, Chelsea. And Sarah says, I statements always work the best. Totally. I statements are a really important piece, and we'll get into that in just a second here.
Okay. Am I good to go to the next slide, Jessica?
Yes, thank you.
So a lot of these are huge topics to unpack. So
Mhm.
these are the barriers to setting healthy boundaries. So we know in ideal situations and ideal relationships, boundary setting, like the ones that we had listed there, it can look really easy, but there are a lot of boundaries to it. Some of them might be safety concerns. For somebody and you know, while we're practicing setting healthy boundaries in our life, we know ourselves, we know our relationships best. So when setting healthy boundaries, I think it's best to always be intuitive, to, you know, if you are safe setting a boundary with a person, or if you have any idea what their maybe response to that would be. So yeah, one of the boundaries is safety concerns. Anxiety, there's a lot of anxiety around setting boundaries and what the person's response might be, because like we said, um, can't control the person's response. Another one is trauma. A lot of trauma from the past and fear of what the response might be from the person that you're setting the boundary with, or even the trauma of maybe being a child whose emotions were not validated in their childhood, and maybe did not have the space to speak up. Fear, uncertainty of self, lower self esteem, oppression. We know that it's easier for people who don't come or who don't have maybe who aren't part of marginalized identities or groups, maybe have more struggles and boundaries and barriers, or and more barriers to setting boundaries. Power imbalances in relationships. If you're thinking about setting a boundary with somebody who's above you, like a boss, you know, that's something to recognize. Lack of understanding about boundaries and maybe self, conflict avoidance, and not knowing where to start. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Jessica. I feel like this whole could be there could be slides multiple on each of these. They're huge topics to unpack.
Yeah. I, I really want to acknowledge and validate the significance of each of these points that are on this slide being a barrier
Mm-hmm.
to setting healthy boundaries. I also want to acknowledge that if anyone is watching this presentation and you identify and can relate to any of the points on this slide, and you're thinking about, you know, a certain relationship or a certain circumstance in your life, these are barriers. They are not barricades,
Mm-hmm.
and they are not blockages. And while they may present additional challenges, healthy boundaries are possible to set for everyone. And so, whether that means bringing in some additional supports to help keep things safe or to help guide you or to, develop some skills so that you can, sometimes even create your voice, but strengthen your voice and use your voice. Um, it is very possible for somebody who, experiences any of these things to set healthy boundaries. I also want to just point out that just because there are these barriers here and there may be some additional challenges, you know, this does not mean that these people who identify with these may have additional challenges in setting healthy boundaries. It doesn't mean they are any less deserving of having
Mm-hmm.
healthy boundaries. And so finding ways to support any one of these things so that healthy boundaries can be set is a really, really important task and goal that should, be a high priority.
Mm-hmm.
We look at some things that can stem of not having healthy boundaries, and the cost is really high. So I'm really grateful to be participating in this presentation today. And if anyone is looking for some additional supports, just know that there is a slide at the end of this presentation with a bunch of community resources and campus resources that can help you. And we'll have that up, and you can take a picture or access this presentation at a later time as it is. So check on the chat here. Please, can you expand a little on trauma and power imbalances? Yeah, for sure. So for trauma, in healthy boundaries, sometimes as a trauma response, we can kind of we don't feel that we have, I'll speak for myself personally, as I am, a survivor of some trauma. I did learn definitely to discount my own, needs, thoughts and feelings at a really young age. And I wasn't really ever provided the tools to learn how to take a stand for myself and speak up. And so, we'll get into some different visuals around like what boundaries might look like in just a slide or two here, I think. But I really, wasn't able to ever kind of, I was aware of what I was comfortable with or not comfortable with inside. But I would either kind of like barricade, block people out as a defense mechanism, or I would just kind of let people walk all over me. I wasn't able to really like in a healthy way voice what I was okay with or not okay with until I was in certain situations. And most of the time I let people just kind of play Blue's Clues around what are my boundaries. So that was a really unhealthy situation for me. And I'm still definitely not perfect at setting boundaries. When I do presentations like this, I really want to be like very clear that, I'm a student wellness ambassador. By no means am I an expert in boundaries, right? It's a constant learning journey for me. I think like every other human being. And power imbalances. So what we mean by power imbalances is, and also Takara, feel free to jump in anytime too. Power imbalances would be like if there's an authority figure or someone that's considered an authority figure in a relationship. So whether that mean, like was mentioned, like you're like a boss, like a employer boss, or like a professor, someone that's considered like in some level of social hierarchy above you in some way, would be a power imbalance. Also within relationships, if we're talking about like a romantic relationship, if there's one partner that controls the finances, or, the lease is in their name, or the car insurance is in their name, things like that can also contribute to a power imbalance. And can sometimes be a barrier in setting healthy boundaries. So like an example of that might be, if there's two people and both partners share the vehicle, and one of them, covers the insurance, or one of them typically fills the gas tank more, and the other one tries to set a boundary around, I would really appreciate it if I could, have access to the car on these days because it's like my schedule and blah, blah, blah. And they might feel a little bit like they don't have grounds to voice themselves and set a healthy boundary around, or, like I'm not really comfortable with you taking the car that we both paid for on like 7-hour road trips with no winter tire, something like that, right? That can definitely cause someone to feel that they don't have grounds to stand on to voice themselves and voice their boundary. I guess it typically be, yeah. If you have any extra thoughts, Takara, I'm not sure that I explained that very well, but
no, I think you explained all of that really well. And I think that's, I guess, when we're talking about, especially when we look at trauma, oppression, and power imbalances, I think it is important to step outside of ourselves and recognize that boundary setting is not just happening in the ideal healthy scenarios. They can be happening in scenarios where safety might be compromised as well, and real structural concerns are happening. So I think that's just why it's important, as Jessica mentioned before. We'll go into some additional supports near the end. But yeah, it's important to be intuitive, know your safety, but always put your worth and safety first in yourself. And I think, yeah, a lot of them, they're not always the easy conversations. Kind of maybe some of them might be a little bit more difficult than some of the examples we brought up as well. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think Jessica covered most of it all. I think that's all I had to say left about that. Are we good to move on to the next slide?
Yeah, let's move on to the next slide. And then, yeah, if there's anything you want further explained on that, Bibi, we do have like a little time at the end of the presentation that you can stick around and we'll answer some questions if anyone has any and they didn't throw them in the chat during the presentation. So. Okay, so the ocean, fortress, and fence. So this is what I kind of just referenced while attempting to explain how trauma can sometimes contribute to barriers to healthy boundaries. So this is one of the ways that I learned about boundaries, because, a while ago I had no idea what boundaries were. Several years ago when I first started learning about them, this was extremely helpful for me. So we think of boundaries, we can think of them as an ocean, fortress, and fence, and all of them do exist. They're styles of boundaries, right? So for the ocean, it's just kind of, there's nothing there, right? Anything and everything just kind of flows into each other and comes and goes whenever it pleases, without there being anything of kind of a protective force. So the ocean, when boundaries have not been created, or they haven't been expressed, or they haven't been upheld, right? So if we set a boundary, but then we don't take that action to uphold our own boundaries, then it's kind of like there's nothing there really. And this can lead to resentments in relationships, diminished self-esteem, and also codependency for sure in relationships. And the fortress is like a humongous barricade, right? It's like nothing can get out and nothing can get in. This is typically really seen as like a huge defense mechanism. And it's the all or nothing thinking, right? It's really rigid dictations or rules that we set with other people on how to treat us. So this is, we see the fortress when we see things like, you can't do this, or like, you have to stop doing this, or like, you need to do this. And it's the responsibility is on the other person's lap. And then also if someone, kind of slights or breaks our boundaries, and instead of approaching it in a healthy way, which we will get to later in this presentation, we're just kind of like, well, they broke my boundaries and that's it. And we just kind of like wall up and block them out. This is the fortress. And it can lead to social isolation, interpersonal difficulties, and resentments. And then I also just wanted to add a little note here that sometimes in certain unsafe or toxic relationships or situations, the fortress is actually a healthy thing, a healthy boundary. And then we have the fence, which is typically what a healthy boundary might look like. And it's when we clearly communicate what we're comfortable accepting, what we're not comfortable accepting or not going to accept, and then we align our actions and we take that responsible action congruent with the things that we communicate with our boundaries. So the fence kind of allows a harmonious flow of giving and receiving consciously in relationships, while still preserving oneself. So the fence is typically what a healthy boundary looks like. But again, just to make note that in certain situations, sometimes the fortress is also very much needed for our own safety and can be the healthiest thing for us. Catch up on the chat here. Okay, we're good. So unless you have anything to add, Cara, then we can go to the next slide.
No, I'm good. And I absolutely love this. Just like this visual. I think it's really great. I hadn't heard about it before you.
Oh, thanks. Okay, so a 3-step how-to for boundaries. So the first thing we want to do is create. So we want to be able to identify and get in touch with ourselves. How does this make me feel? How would I like to feel in this situation alternatively? And we can kind of brainstorm what things might be needed or what changes could happen to help get us from how we're feeling to how we want to feel, right? So, and not so much, we want to keep ourselves empowered in this situation too, right, when we're brainstorming. So we don't want to think of, well, if this person would only stop doing this, or, if this part of the world would change, like we want to think, okay, so what are some things that I can do to help myself really, grow or feel more empowered or feel safer or feel more valued or more respected or happier, whatever it may be. So we also want to contemplate why this exists and why this boundary is important to us, which can be also a really important part of getting in touch with our values in creating healthy boundaries. we want to state our boundaries. So we want to make sure, like we mentioned earlier, right, our boundaries are not known until we actually communicate them, and people can't really play Blue's Clues with us about what our boundaries are. It's our responsibility to communicate those, right? So we want to do that really clearly and directly and respectfully to the other person in the relationship. We want to remain open to discussion, but not necessarily open to debate. So, if we state a boundary and the person asks, I'd like to understand that more. Can you help? Can you clarify or can you elaborate? Totally be, to your comfortability, try and be open to doing that, because it can really help add to the value of a relationship and help us feel understood and heard. But try not to, approach with it being debatable, especially if you're setting boundaries for things like safety. Some of those things are not up for debate, and that's totally fair. And then we want to also let go of the result, right? So like we mentioned earlier, we can communicate our boundaries, and it sure would be nice if everyone would honor and respect them. That might not always happen, but it's about us taking that action to ensure that our boundaries are upheld, right? And making sure that we create a plan when we're in that creation stage about, okay, so if my boundary isn't upheld, what am I prepared to do? That can be a really important piece too before we actually go ahead and state them. And then we want to maintain, right? So we want to ensure that our actions that we're personally taking are honoring the boundaries that we've created. We want to maybe revisit those boundaries over time, because as we go through life and we go through life and grow and learn and adapt, so do our boundaries. So we want to make sure that we're kind of like checking in on ourselves and our boundaries every now and then to see if they still work for us or if we need to kind of reevaluate. We want to make sure we're fulfilling ourselves so that we don't end up, going back on our own boundaries. And then if someone does cross our boundaries or kind of break our boundaries, then we want to make sure we address that appropriately when we need to. We can go to the next slide.
Okay. Oh, this one's me. Okay. So these are some helpful tips when setting boundaries. So journaling on why boundary is important to you. Yeah, I mean, it could look like different things for you. It could be having a conversation with a friend, or just, quiet contemplation. But I think for me, the act of slowing down and journaling, it helps me process my thoughts a little bit better, writing it out. I think it's also almost a way of practicing it before you do set that boundary. Connecting with supportive people, right? It can be scary and we don't know what's going to happen when we set a boundary with somebody in our lives. If it might alter the relationship, and the relationship, you're never sure the outcome. So it's good to connect with supportive people who support your decision and can help raise you up. Honor your intuition. I think that's a really big one, especially with safety. If in your gut feeling you're questioning whether or not this is reasonable or if you're being unnecessary, I think that first step where it makes you feel uncomfortable, that your urge to set a boundary, I think that's something to honor and follow. Maintain personal responsibility for your boundaries being upheld. So we've touched on this a couple times, but once again, you're just always going to be reassessing in your relationships. And if you need to confront a boundary being upheld, so maintaining personal responsibility. And if that boundary is not being upheld, then you're kind of given, a choice on how you want to carry on that relationship or not. And then remember that no matter the outcome, your thoughts and feelings are valid. And here's some things to avoid when you're setting boundaries. So making you statements while communicating your boundaries. I think Jessica already covered this really well. But once again, it actually takes the power away from you, and I'm trying to think of the right word, but it just pushes kind of your needs on somebody else. Backpedaling or second guessing yourself. Dismissing your thoughts, feelings, or intuition, and then making your boundaries the other individual's responsibilities.
Yeah, and just one more thing that I forgot to actually add to this slide, but is super important too. When setting boundaries, sometimes, we do, it's easier said than done, especially in certain situations or with certain people that we really care about. Those really meaningful relationships. Setting boundaries can be really tricky. And sometimes people might not always respond how we had necessarily hoped. And so it's really important, although it's very tempting sometimes, not to take responsibility for the other person's feelings or reactions. That is not ours, that is theirs. And, you know, we are responsible and accountable for our side of the street, our feelings, our communication, our actions, but we are not in any way responsible for their feelings, their expression or response to our boundaries. That is their stuff. They are responsible for that. And so when we're making that boundary, you know, we want to avoid making our boundary their responsibility, but we also don't want to take responsibility for how they respond to our boundary. That's a really important piece.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely can't believe I forgot to put that on this slide, but we will edit.
Well, and I think we've also consistently revisited that too throughout this, and I do think that's a really important foundation in this process.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so breaking boundaries, how to handle it. So yeah, we just kind of compiled some tips to handle it because, you know, as we've reiterated, it's not an easy thing to do. So even when we communicate our boundaries in a healthy way, they aren't always respected. So like we said before, I think it's a good thing to remind yourself this and be prepared for that outcome. When someone doesn't honor the boundaries we're conveyed, it sucks. It doesn't feel good. It feels like we're not respected. It feels like our feelings and our thoughts are invalidated or minimized. So that's where that important piece that Jessica spoke on comes in, of really fulfilling yourself, is making sure that you're practicing self-care and taking care of yourself throughout this process. It's totally normal to feel angry, frustrated, hurt, sad, or anything else you may be feeling when this happens. And I think that's where it's important to kind of take that downtime to really reflect on things and think of what's the best response to be productive and helpful in this relationship. Maybe not always acting at first on that anger or hurt, although those are valid feelings and we can't be perfect all the time. Understand that someone going against our boundaries is not a statement of our value or worth in any way. So when addressing a broken boundary, it's good to plan ahead. So like I said before, journal on your feelings, phone a friend, assess the situation, remember why, and make a safety plan. Taking action, use your voice, strong back, soft front, wild heart. I think, Jessica, did you add that? Is that something you want to talk about?
Yeah, I did add that. I know that we have some Brene Brown fans with the Wellness Center, and I definitely am one as well. And that's actually her philosophy. It's from her book, Braving the Wilderness. And it's something that I use in life all the time, which I've actually applied to my own personal learning and setting boundaries. And it's been a really helpful strategy for me where when we're taking that responsible action, you know, strong back would be like, these are my values. This is where I stand. This is like, you know, I'm supported in myself. I'm grounded in myself. I understand that. Soft front means I'm going to take in things. I'm going to be open to feedback. I'm going to be open to discussion, but I have that strong back and I know where I stand. And then wild heart is just, you know, always going back to yourself and like your heart and your soul self, and like knowing authentically who you are and being, you know, able to provide that self-love with yourself and like show up authentically from your whole heart, and just letting, you know, not letting adverse experiences per se, I guess, taint who you are. Just always like being able to go home to yourself, no matter what happens. It's kind of like the Reader's Digest version of the strong back, soft front, wild heart philosophy. So I definitely use that in life often. I also just wanted to point out, we had a really important point from Chelsea in the chat about what something to avoid while setting boundaries. And she says, Also, I think not apologizing for setting a boundary is really important. That is really important, because setting boundaries and having healthy boundaries, regardless of any circumstances, regardless of any barriers, regardless of what the relationship looks like, healthy boundaries are our natural birthright to have and set. And so we don't want to, sometimes that can kind of, if we get a really strong negative reaction to a healthy boundary we have attempted to set, it can kind of be tempting. Society has kind of instilled that in us, that no matter what, if someone responds to you unpleasantly because of something you've said, then you're supposed to apologize. That's not always the case. And that's not the case when it comes to setting healthy boundaries. So, yeah. So throw that in the taking action. Don't apologize, folks.
And then the last step is aftercare. So that includes checking in with a safe person, practicing self-compassion and self-care. And aftercare is something, I think until I was making these slides, I realized that I really do have like a set out kind of plan ahead, taking action aftercare routine that I've gone through when setting boundaries. I've got a really wonderful friend, Cass, and she's somebody that I often go to when I'm identifying something unhealthy in my other relationships or anything like that. And I always talk to her beforehand. She's somebody I've identified as a safe person to talk to this about, who often gives an unbiased opinion, but also really values me taking care of myself. So I've deemed her as one of my safe people. And always before I give her a phone call, she checks in with me while I'm doing it. And then we do an after discussion to really work through everything that comes up. So I think it's important to identify the safe people in your life who want the best for you, who will support you in this process. And then practice some self-compassion. Be really proud of yourself. It's not an easy thing to do. And make sure to give some time to self-care, because it's an emotionally draining process, breaking boundaries is. So yeah, do you have anything else to add to that, Jessica?
I love the point you made about like the safe person. I think it's so important. And if you find yourself right now like kind of uncertain about like who are some safe people in my life that I would feel comfortable, having these kinds of discussions with, or like turning to when it's kind of like a moment for me. And if you're finding that, you're kind of uncertain, or like you maybe don't have those people in your life right now, just know that you're not alone. And there are lots of resources that you can reach out to, the Wellness Center always being one of them. And we're happy to help in any way that we possibly can, and just be there, even just to listen, right? Is really, sometimes just having someone to listen to us. I really believe that people start to heal when they feel seen and heard. So like, we see you, we hear you, and we're here. Really important. Okay, so I included this meme because I love this meme so much. Actual photo of my first attempt at boundaries. This is like real life for me. This is how it went. And this is kind of how it's a learning experience, right? So yeah, no relationship is perfect. I think it's totally necessary and healthy to expect mutual respect, trust, and safety at all times. But boundaries in relationships, if broken, and they don't compromise your respect, trust, and safety, they can be really great opportunities for further learning and healing and growing together within a relationship and building that relationship up. All relationships are teachers, and the challenges that arise are our own individual assignments and lessons, right? So kind of going back to like how, as we go through life and we adapt and grow, so do our boundaries, right? So some things that we were okay with, like even earlier this year, or maybe a couple years ago, maybe even last week, maybe they're not really serving us anymore today, or maybe, vice versa, right? Something I was not okay with in the past, maybe I'm okay with now. As relationships change, so do our boundaries, right? So allowing learning to take place for yourself and for others can really strengthen and improve the health and meaning of a relationship. And so just also to understanding that like no human being gets it perfect, right? People aren't always going to super perfectly respect our boundaries. You know, as long as, yeah, that's where like listening to your intuition comes really big into play, right? If someone's kind of like broken out boundaries and it's unintentional, and we check in with ourselves and we're like, okay, how am I feeling about this? Am I feeling super disrespected? Am I feeling unsafe? Did this compromise our trust? Certain things like that, right? Being able to tap into that inner knowing, to search for like the starting point of guidance from there, right? And sometimes, yeah, navigating those kinds of situations and just holding space that allows for growth can be a really, really valuable experience. So that's also an important note too, right? Because yeah, I'm much better today at setting boundaries, but this literally was how my first boundary looked, like cheesy in the padlock and thinking that's going to solve the problem for sure.
Me too. I think whenever I think of boundaries, I constantly, and boundaries are happening in friendships, like family relationships, everything, but I always reflect back on my romantic relationships and I am just astounded. I'm definitely super proud of myself for the growth when I look at my first romantic relationship to my current one. And like you said, all relationships are teachers, and you're just going to get better and better as you do it. Yeah, and I'm super thankful for all the learning experiences I had that. And I'm still not perfect at setting boundaries, but I feel a lot more confident and competent in it than when I started the journey.
Yeah.
So as we spoke to before, so that was a lot of content to digest. And as we said, setting boundaries, yeah, it can be emotionally draining. It can be a really emotional, tough thing to do. So here are some resources and supports. We have on-campus resources, which includes the TRU Wellness Center, TRU Counseling Services, Sexualized Violence Prevention and Response Center, the TRU Medical Center, the Multi-Faith Chaplain Services, and the House 5 Friendship Center. And then we've also included some off-campus resources. There's Here to Talk chat line, Interior Crisis Line, Kamloops Mental Health, the Kamloops Sexual Assault Counseling Center, 24-hour anti-violence hotline, RCMP Victim Services, and Safe Spaces. Oh, sorry, I'll go back. Maybe I'll give a minute if anybody wants to take a picture of that or something.
Yeah. And while we have that up, we'll just leave this up, and we have a question that came up in the chat for us. How can you express vulnerability while setting boundaries? I think personally, like my personal opinion would be that to set boundaries is actually to be really vulnerable. I think it takes a lot of vulnerability and a lot of courage. And, you know, just being willing, because it can, you know, especially in certain relationships and like with the way that certain things are in society today, certain attitudes, just to say, you know, hey, here's how I'm feeling is something that by and large we're not really encouraged to do, especially if it's a new relationship or, you know, if you don't really know this person that well, or if there is some kind of like a power imbalance, that, you know, that is a huge expression of vulnerability. And I think that's definitely something that, you know, deserves to be honored and acknowledged. It can't, yeah, because that it does take a lot, right? To express like where we like show up authentically as ourselves, who we truly are, and let that be known, and say what's going on for us in our heads and hearts. And I think that's kind of what vulnerability is to me anyway. So I don't know if you have any tips in that regard.
No, I think that resonates with me too. I think setting boundaries is an inherently vulnerable process. And I also think, if I'm thinking about personal examples for myself, once again, this depends on your relationship and your own personal communication styles, but I've absolutely have said, I'm really nervous to do this, or said afterwards, like, and this is in the context of a person that I do feel safe with and, you know, trust and that I'm setting a boundary with, but I've been forthright and just said, this is really hard for me to bring up. I've definitely cried. which I'm not necessarily saying I recommend that, but it happens. And just said afterwards that was really difficult for me to do. But I'm happy I did it, and it's something that's important to me. So I think it just depends on finding out your communication style as you kind of go through the journey of learning how you set boundaries.
All righty, so time to wrap up. So I thought it's, we covered a lot of ground today and we unpacked quite a bit of stuff. And, I know reflecting on my own journey with setting boundaries, and Kara's also mentioned her journey with setting boundaries. Sometimes, discussing these things and looking at these things kind of, it promotes in our minds like peeling of the onion, right? And that can bring up a lot of stuff. So I thought, it might be a good idea to just do a little mini self-care right now all together, and just invite everyone to, if they so choose, to take like 3 breaths at your own pace. Just like really the kind of breathing that really engages your parasympathetic nervous system. So you just want to kind of like double your inhale from your I think I got this wrong. Yeah, I totally switched this around in the slides, but you're supposed to double your exhale, not your inhale. So we would maybe breathe in for 3 seconds and then breathe out for 6 seconds. And while everyone's breathing, maybe just taking a moment to just reflect on some things that you can do today after this presentation, or at some point in the day, to practice some self-care. If you wanted to, when you feel ready to, you can, unmute yourself and speak over the microphone, or you can throw some things in the chat. Really important today to be practicing lots of self-compassion. And if you find that you're struggling with boundary setting, or someone's recently broken your boundaries, like really practicing some self-love and some self-affirmations, and just knowing that you're worthy of setting boundaries, and that tricky situations don't last forever. I know on days where, it's probably just an excuse to treat myself, but on days where we unpack some stuff with wellness, I like to go get myself a fancy coffee. So I'll be doing that. Probably get me a London fog today, I think.
Hi, I just wanted to share. I just wanted to say that I really admire both Jessica and Takara, and watching you guys and working with you in a peer mentor setting. You both are, I have noticed, are very good at setting your boundaries. So I think that's a really good thing that I've been able to look up to both of you, to practice setting boundaries in like a work setting and in like just in general, I guess. So I've really appreciated that from the both of you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Sarah, that's so sweet.
That's so sweet. Thank you. And I'm happy that you're taking this time and making space to set boundaries.
Yes. And I also wanted to share too, I think another one is online boundaries. So not necessarily when it's related to another person, but when it's like a page on Facebook that you keep clicking or looking for things, especially now too with the pandemic, and looking at information and getting lost in the scroll and kind of looking at things that maybe don't help your mind as much, I guess, and just kind of taking time away from social media, and also to muting people when it's not necessarily a place where you want to have a conversation about it and you don't want to bring it up, but just muting someone online and being like, I don't need to look at this all the time because this bothers me. But yeah, I've had to practice that a lot lately.
For sure. Thank you, Sarah. That's a really important point for sure. Especially online, especially with the amount of time that people are spending online lately too. I think it's really, for me personally, helped me be really mindful of okay, if I'm gonna be on social media, then like what am I gonna have on my social media, and what am I gonna choose not to, or what am I gonna choose to not engage with? And um I get lots of like messages sent to me, and I get tagged in lots of things, and oftentimes I personally, I don't believe in any like diet culture resources at all, and I've had some friends lately that are like very adamantly trying to win like a product that's really heavily endorsed by diet culture. And so there's like those challenges, like those giveaway challenges on social media, and they keep tagging me. And so I've blocked the page so they can't actually tag me, and I had to have conversations with those people too, right? So and just like mute those kinds of activities is really helpful for not necessarily creating a big deal about it, but also it is a responsible action that we can personally take. It's important. So we got a couple things in the chat. So Livy says, to take care of myself today, I'm going to go eat some carrots and hummus and look for some new music, maybe make a playlist. I love playlists. We should make like a wellness in your house of all Livy's playlists, I think.
Yeah.
Thanks for all the tips, validation, and love. I feel better than when I hopped on. That's so awesome. That's so good to hear. And then BB says, setting boundaries with family members is the most difficult for me, especially for the fact that I am from an African home. Yeah, that's totally valid. And I think that sometimes with our family members, especially like parents, because, although we're adults now, like growing up, that's a power imbalance. Your parents are in a different position of power than you. So I know for me personally, I love my family, but there's, boundaries are still a task. And it is a learning experience, and trying to like hold that attitude of, they're learning just like I am, because we never had these kinds of things in my family, right? Everybody's family dynamics are really different. So boundaries were definitely a foreign concept for us, and it's been interesting to navigate, but it's also been really interesting to watch the changes happening for both myself and my family members. And yeah.
Team, I just wanted to say, I'm just thinking what BB's comment about, in terms of when we talked about some of the barriers, or sometimes there's cultural expectations that we have in our families. And so if we don't necessarily align with some of those cultural expectations, I can definitely see how setting a boundary would be very challenging. But within that, I just wanted to say thank you both so much. I'm looking at the time and I have to set a boundary because I have to go. But I wish I could stay, because I have to say to the two of you, I'm really, really proud of this Wellness in Your House. I've been proud of all of you ambassadors this semester. I'm really inspired by the content that, of these sessions that you put together for our campus. I'm inspired by the effort that you put in, and inspired by the professionalism and facilitation skills that all of you have had. So I just want to say thank you. I think this is a really good presentation that people, I think of all ages, like employees, should be watching on our campus. And because, as you said, as we go upon in life, our boundaries may shift and change, and it takes practice. And if you don't practice setting boundaries, it's hard, regardless of how old you are or experiences that you've had. So I just want to say thank you both. This is just really wonderful opportunity for people